All right, my name is Laurelin, and I want to welcome you to my single entry, which is a recreation of a early 16th century Italian master copy oil painting, which is a huge amount to say. And really, what does all that mean? Mostly it means it's an oil painting done by myself. I approached this actually as trying to be an apprentice to a great master. I wanted to learn what apprentices would learn in period. I wanted to learn from the ground up. I wanted to learn all the things that apprentice would be expected to know. And I wanted to learn from one master. Now, I chose Leonardo da Vinci. It was between him and Titian, but I chose Leonardo da Vinci because Leonardo da Vinci barely finished anything. I mean, the guy was a nut. He experimented, he barely finished anything, but those things that he did not finish are time capsules into this process. And they were very, very helpful in deciding how I wanted to approach it. Because when I got into the literature, and there is a lot of literature about this, the literature was not always specific or focused on just exactly how things went. I mean, they did talk about it, but it was easier to look at the literature, and there's a ton of it out there, and then look at Leonardo's unfinished stuff and realize, okay, so this is how the sketch went on. And don't worry, this is kind of a preamble. I will go through the steps with you. But I wanted you to understand why it is that I did this. I want to paint this way, and I specifically want to paint in this style, because I think this is really a seminal style for master copy work and for masterworks from here on out. Before this point, painting was kind of a sort of a new thing, and they didn't quite know how everything went together. They didn't quite know how things worked. And a lot of the paintings, like the Wedding of Arnolfini, is everyone familiar with that? That's actually egg tempera with an oil glaze over the top. So there's this transitory period from illumination to oil painting. This has its roots in illumination, and the way that this is done is very reminiscent of that. So this time period, this 1500 to 1510, they're still painting on panel, which I have discovered that I quite enjoy. They're still using a lot of the illumination process, but it's oil paint. And so that specific point in time was what I wanted to study, and I wanted to study one master. In period, that's actually a process that they encouraged apprentices and students to do. Master copy work means that you are copying a master work or copying a certain master. Like I said, I chose Leonardo da Vinci because, again, he was a nut, and there's a lot of things that he did, but nobody paints like Leonardo. It's very specific. I almost chose Titian, but Titian had this really lovely long career. And so what he did in the early 1500s is much different than what he did in the late 1500s. And while that is charming, I wanted to stick real close to about 1500 to 1510. And may I just say that, having researched other things in the SCA, this was probably the most easiest thing to research ever. Ever. Because there are people in the modern world who have spent their lifetimes just on one painting. They have reams are written about this. I don't usually do this, but this is a book on the Mona Lisa painting itself. That's all they talk about. They talk about the pigments. They've x-rayed her. They've done all these radiographic things. They've decided how much lead white is in there. They have even measured the micron paint film layer. They have also measured how warped she is. So reams and reams and reams and reams have been written on this. This part of it was easy. It was a dream, because when you try and research almost anything else in the SCA, you have to extrapolate. Nobody has done it before, or maybe they have, or the Victorians have screwed it up, or whatever, right? So, I mean, we've all felt that pain, where you find something, but you can't find definitive proof of anything sometimes. And it gets worse the further back you go. There was virtually nothing I had to really think about in this process. I did do a lot of getting into the literature. Leonardo's Treatise on Painting was one of the first books I read. Cennini has a lot to say about it. Vasari, even though he's something of a gossip, also had a lot to say about it. Believe it or not, oil painting is actually much further back than this time period. Theophilus talks about oil painting. The Mappe Clavicula talks about oil painting. The Greeks knew about oil painting. The difference between that oil painting and this is the fact that they discovered, that oil paint dries much faster when it is properly processed with what's called either a stand oil or sun thickened oil, and I'll get into that too. So anyway, I could get into the history. I could just go on and on and on about the history. There's just an enormous amount of history, which is why I'm going to leave that to the documentation, because I want to show you this process. And I want to tell you right now, I want you to keep a very open mind, because every single one of you in this room could do this. Now, don't look at me like that. Don't look at me like that. You could do this. You really could. Artists in period were not these creative geniuses, you wake up and think, I'm just going to paint. It was a profession, and you learned how to do it. You were taught how to do it, and there was a certain way that you were taught. And even if you couldn't draw very well, by the end of it, there was a part of this profession that you could do. So not everything was artistic. That is a very modern notion. And so that's how I approached this. Every day I painted, at least an hour. It was my profession. I sketched every day, because that's what both Cennini and Leonardo da Vinci and Vasari and Alberti, all the treatises talk about. Drawing is the basis of painting. So I drew every day. So that was the basics of all of this. So keep an open mind, and let me go through the process. The original Mona Lisa is actually this size. And I know that's hard to believe. And in fact, I scared myself. When I first did this, I took the size of the Mona Lisa, the panel, as was told to me by, I forget what book, and I cut the panel out because it's a wood panel, and wood panels were used in period up to this point in time. They didn't actually start using canvas for painting until about 1510, 1515, 1520. So I decided to do it in panel. The original is on a white Lombardy poplar, one whole panel of Lombardy poplar, which I could not get my hands on. One whole sheet of poplar, half an inch thick, probably would have cost me more than I was willing to pay. So I did it on plywood, but it's a poplar or an oak plywood, and I did it on plywood for a couple of reasons. Because we live in the Great Northwest, there's a lot of humidity, and I wanted my painting to not work. I wanted to make sure it wouldn't work. In fact, I did this is another master copy. I did a couple of different things. I painted it on 1/4 inch, and then I put in these lovely strips to make sure it wouldn't work. It worked anyway, because the paint film on there pulled everything in. So as anal as you can be about this, there are certain parts of this process you just aren't going to be able to control. And so I had to make my peace with it, and I put it in a frame, and now nobody knows. Well, you guys know now, but... So it is a nice 1/4 inch piece of oak with some struts behind it, and I'm not going to pick her up, but she's basically the same as the back there. The actual original is on a 1/2 inch poplar, and the Prado copy, which there's a reason why I'm introducing that. The Prado copy was painted on almost 1/4 inch poplar of a different type. So these wood panels were sometimes knitted together. I mean, there's pieces that have been put together, which once you put the gesso on there, it kind of does its thing for a few years, and then it completely cracks and breaks apart. But by that time, you've already sold it and you've moved on, right? So nobody cares. But I actually cared. I wanted to make sure that this would stay flat and nice. And like I said, I couldn't control even a plywood panel warps under this process. The interesting thing, however, is that once I got this done in December, it was very, very warped. As the months have progressed, the warping has lessened. So eventually she will go back into straight. So that was a learning process. And the plywood was the only thing that I did that wasn't period. I really did think about getting a panel just to see how it worked. But as I said, I am still in the apprentice phase of this. As an apprentice, they probably would not have spent that kind of money on me. I would have learned however I needed to learn on whatever piece of wood I could have gotten. I wouldn't have been worth that. So I went ahead and just made my peace with the plywood and moved on. Because really, once the plywood is covered, it almost doesn't matter. It's just a surface at that point. So after the plywood was gotten together and I cut it the right size, and then I freaked out a couple of times. I actually emailed the Louvre and said, please tell me that this is the right size. Best French, right? Best formal French, please tell me that I'm not freaking out. After I did all those things and realized this was the size, I got a little scared because this is huge. That was my first master copy, and I thought she was that size. And this is enormous compared to that. So once I independently verified 3 times that this was actually the right size, made sure that I wasn't freaking out, made sure I wasn't doing something stupid, it was then time to take the plunge and get this panel ready to paint. Now, this particular method is very foundational. There are certain steps that have to happen before the next step happens. It is very much a progression, and very much if you screw up one step, you should stop, fix it, and then move on. Do not keep going. Right? I left the screwed up paintings behind at home because I didn't want you to see them. But trust me on this one. You really want to get your foundations down. It makes a huge amount of sense to do so because paints are translucent. And it also makes a huge amount of sense because you will screw it up. And I did several times. I think I had to beat my head against the wall a couple of times before I realized not to do things. In order to get this ready for paint, because wood, if oil sinks into wood, it will actually rot the wood. If oil sinks into canvas, it will actually rot the canvas. In order to get those surfaces ready to paint, you have to do a number of things to them. The first thing is to add a sizing of hide glue, which is nothing more than hide made into glue, which is water and some warmth and scrapings of hide, very period. And Chenini talks about it. Everybody talks about it. You put that over the panel, and the panel should be as smooth as possible. If there's any imperfections, you can take some putty and put it in there, but it has to be smooth. And then once you put the sizing on, you let that dry, and then it comes time for what's called the gesso. Now here's where I actually deviated a little bit from the common Italian practices. There are 2 schools of painting going on at this point in time. There's the Flemish, and then there's the Italian. And they do things slightly differently at this gesso layer. But after I panicked and realized that maybe I had made a mistake, I kept reading Chenini, and Chenini said, well, this is the way that I think would be great, but if you have to do it this way, then So even in period, it wasn't a hard and fast rule. Another reason why this time period, this 1500 time period, is actually great. So what I did is I mixed up a little bit of hide glue again, a little bit of plaster of Paris, and some lead white pigment. And that goes into a nice mixture. It's a 1-to-1-to-1 mixture, and it makes up this very nice chalky gesso. And I layered it on first one way, as Chenini suggests, and then I layered it on the next after everything was dry, sanded it until it was nice and smooth, did that again, sanded it until it was nice and smooth, and did that again, because you're supposed to do at least 4 coats, so I followed Chenini to the letter. That was the biggest pain in the world, because this stuff, it essentially becomes like a fresco. It's like a chalk. And so when you're not paying attention, and you're watching your favorite TV show, and you're sanding, and you accidentally tip the sander, and you put huge grooves in it, you have to fix that. Also, because again, I am an apprentice doing this, I had to learn that what smooth meant smooth. It didn't mean until I thought it was smooth. It meant smooth. If you take a look at this has got the same gesso layer on it. Can you see the ridges?
Yep.
I have no patience. That's from the gesso layer. When they say smooth, they mean smooth. They don't mean until Laurelin figures like she's done. They mean smooth. What's that? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. These are all dry. So it has to be smooth. And this layer has to be smooth because when you start painting on it, these paint layers are so thin. They're microns thin. This is not modern painting. They're so thin that every imperfection shows. So that's my exemplar for patience. You must be patient. You must get that gesso layer on there. So anyway, I learned my lesson, and I got this gesso layer very smooth. There are some bits to it, but that I will talk about later because I dropped it after I was done with it. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, so once the gesso layer is on, it is time to figure out how you're going to get your sketch on there. You're going to put one more layer of hide glue to seal the gesso from the oil paint, because that is the thing that I discovered that I thought was really, really cool. Take that. Was that this is all done with modern materials. This is a modern gesso, a modern pigments, modern paints out of tubes, modern everything. And I discovered that the interesting thing about doing things modernly is that while they are easy to get. I mean, these pigments are easy to get. There's some things that happen that make it not so much fun. And one of the things about this particular painting, if I direct you to look at this. So do you see how luminous this is and how bright it is and how it kind of shines? And you see how this one does not? The reason is because this has no lead white in it.
Yeah.
Lead white is the foundation of this painting style. You simply cannot get a good period-looking painting without using lead white. And I can hook you up with a couple of different companies if you're interested, because lead white is available. People still paint with it. So once you get that on there, once you get the lead white on there, now the Flemish school did that sort of thing. In the Italian school, it was actually much more usual to do the gesso without the pigment and then do one layer of pigment. So there was an entire layer of lead white. I didn't do that, mostly because, again, I'm an apprentice and I don't know what I'm doing. And so I'm trying different things, but my next one I actually will do that because I think it'll even be more luminous. Because having never painted like this before, I didn't realize what the modern versus the period would look like. So once all that gesso's done, time to get the sketch on. And the sketch can happen a number of different ways. There is as many ways of getting a sketch on there as there are artists. Leonardo seemed to enjoy putting on grids and then just drawing it on there directly, but that was Leonardo da Vinci, and we're not all that good. Some artists, Cennini talks about how to make tracing paper, so that when you're doing all your sketches, you make a tracing paper and you trace on there. And then you can take that and you can either prick it, or you can rub charcoal on the back and use it to transfer onto the gesso. Just for giggles, I actually traced Mona's face here. That looks like a nice piece of modern art, actually. So for giggles, I traced Mona's picture on here, and I went ahead and prepared these little pieces here because this is called indirect painting. And for modern artists, it's sometimes a little hard to wrap your mind around the direct versus indirect painting. Indirect painting is this sort of building up of foundations, not necessarily color immediately. Direct painting, you're actually painting with your pigments full on, directly onto the palette, or onto the canvas. And I was convinced for years that I couldn't oil paint because I can't direct paint. I fuss with it too much. I mess with it. It gets muddy. You lose all your detail, and then all of a sudden it looks like crap and I throw it away because I can't make it work. This holds me back enough and gives me enough foundation that I can actually do this. And again, like I said, any one of you could do this as well. So once I get that started, I put this sketch onto these little guys. But the same process happened here. Although with this one, what I did is I actually sketched directly onto the gesso a la Leonardo da Vinci. It was a lot harder than I thought it would be because I was working from a tiny little picture. And I thought about blowing this picture up. But all I did was sort of grit it up and try and kind of match it up. And it was an exercise in a little bit of frustration. But I wasn't actually out to make an exact copy, and I'll explain that further down the road. The other way that you could do it is that you could go ahead and take copy paper, copy things down, and this is kind of how they composed some stuff. They would take a piece of copy paper and any sketches they'd done. You know, some of those paintings where the necks don't quite fit the heads, the bodies don't quite fit, probably pulled from sketches and studies and then cobbled together into this painting. I could have done that. I chose to just sketch it on. And there's also different ways of doing this because the next step is all about, let me send this around. This is lovely gesso. Don't lick it. It's got lead in it.
And it's on canvas, yes.
Yeah, these are on canvas.
Yes.
But you can kind of feel the thing. So there's different ways of doing this particular thing, getting the sketch on. I could either do the sketch now or I could wait. Because after this, there comes what's called the imprimatura. And the abbozzo, which is the sketch, and the imprimatura can be interchanged a little bit. You can do the imprimatura first and then the abbozzo. You can do the abbozzo and then the imprimatura. Or you can simply kind of squeeze them together. So what I did is I did the sketch on here in red chalk, and I did the imprimatura, and then I did an abbozzo, which means strengthening the lines of the sketch underneath with a little bit of wash, basically, to get all those lines in, because those lines then tell me where I need to paint. So this is the sketch and the Premature together. It is just a wash, and I chose this burnt umber wash, again, thanks to Leonardo da Vinci's inability to finish anything, because a lot of his stuff, I think there's a St. John the Baptist that's unfinished, there's a Mary Magdalene unfinished, there's a bunch of things unfinished, and he actually loved this sort of reddish-brown color, which, happily enough, I like too. One of the things about the Premature, however, is that it does a couple of different things. First, if you try and paint directly onto a white surface, you're fighting against that tone. So you have to get your darks as dark as possible, and your lights are there. So you're going down a lot of steps to get as dark as possible. When you start at a medium tone, your darkest darks can dark much easier, and then you have to put in your lightest lights. And so it's starting from a middle rather than a top. The other thing that it does is it gives it an overall tone beneath this oil, because microscopically there is a bunch of space between these pigments. It's oil paint after all. So the overall tone of this painting is thanks to this. So when we go and look at these masterworks, you remark on the whole overall tone being very tight, very specific. It's because of this foundation, the Sabozo and Premature foundation. So once that's done, once I strengthen all together, and this is where I make composition choices, or I decide, okay, I don't like that hand, or maybe the eyes are cross, or whatever. This is where I kind of make some different decisions about whether or not I like it, move things around, maybe the hand is too small, or maybe I want to add a cherub. Probably not. But maybe I want to do these things. That sketch is kind of where I can do this a little easier. And in fact, when they x-rayed the Mona Lisa, there's all these things that have been moved around, because even Leonardo couldn't make up his mind. The man was a nut. So, even everything gets moved around. And I actually admit, I did a little bit of moving around on my Mona Lisa, because the sketch was just beautiful. I mean, I had really dialed that in. But then when I put the paint wash on it to strengthen it up, she ended up looking like Herman Munster. So I had to go in and be very careful and get it all back together. And eventually I was just like, I got to move on. So I got it down, and I got it to a point where all the positioning was correct and everything, the proportions were dialed in. And then I moved on, because you could spend a number of weeks on that, but it's actually not that important. I know that sounds odd, because I've been hammering on make everything happen. That's not the important part. Everything sort of works together. So once that happened, once that sketch Nabozo, and I toned everything in and got it all good, let it dry, because that's important. I then moved on to what's called the underpainting. The underpainting, and this is where indirect painting, I think, excels. In a modern art class, they hand you a bunch of paints and they say, go to town, have a good time. And usually it's a bunch of these bright colors, and they don't correspond with anything in period, really. I mean, as much as I love acid green, it's not really a period color. So once all that stuff happens, you cannot possibly produce a period work, because it hasn't the same foundation. So doing it this way actually produces a much more period-looking piece, and this is one of the foundations for that. You'll notice that it is grays with a little bit of green in it. This is the underpainting. In the underpainting, she basically started out like this. She was all gray, except for her skin. And her skin was what was called verdaccio, which means a greenish thing. And that's really important for skin tone. Each skin tone, the darker or lighter the skin, they always have like a little green undertone to it. So the lighter the skin, the more sort of greenish it is. The darker the skin, the more teal it is. And it's one of the reasons why I want to learn how to paint different colors of skin, because this actually establishes what's called, in modern parlance, the warm-cool shadows. The warm-cool shadows were not established that way in period. They did not take a layer and establish all your warms and your cools. And what I mean by that, and it's a mind bender, and I'm not going to go into it too far, but basically you look at something and you decide whether or not the shadow is warm or cool. Sounds simple, right? Well, look around. Can you decide that like that? I can't. I hate that part. I suffered through a workshop where I was forced to do the warm-cool layer, and it was horrible. I still haven't recovered. Anyway, this is something entirely different. Once you do the grays, and in this gray scale, basically you're establishing the form, you're establishing the volume, you're establishing the shapes, you're establishing everything about that painting in black and white. You don't have to think about color. So instead of bending your mind around both form and color, you're just doing form. Makes it a lot more simple. These kinds of studies are very popular. In fact, the workshop that I did, this is a green study, modern paints. But this is one of those very useful studies that they try and get people, even now, this atelier, this academy, this Renaissance practice is used to teach people how to paint. This, like I said, is a very modern painting. It's on canvas, and you can see, look how thick the paint is. I mean, it's okay. It's a teaching tool now for me. But the idea here is that you only have one color to worry about, so you are free to express the form and the volume. And that's important. So let me hand this around. You can take a look at it. You can see that I actually did not cover up parts of the Abozo and Premature, and that's on purpose because I want some of that to come through. So let me talk a little bit about. Let me talk a little bit about this particular level. I'm going to talk a little bit about why lead white is so important. If this is something that turns you on, I would encourage you to start learning how to use lead white. And here's why. Not only does it really show in the period versus modern kind of thing, but it actually dries faster. Oil paints are what are called siccative. They dry, which is not specifically true. They don't give off water to dry. They actually take on oxygen. And in the process called polymerization, basically becoming plastic. And it takes them a long time, sometimes 30, 40, 50 years to dry. Once the polymerization is done, then they become crystallized and they crack. So there's no way not to have a painting that doesn't crack. Anyway, the most important part of this verdaccio and this underpainting is to establish your highlights, to establish your lowlights, your shadows, everything. And one of the best ways to do that is to use lead white. Now, this handy reference guide on paints available to the modern painter, this is lead white. And you can see how much thicker it is, how much brighter it is, and what it does in the light. This is a titanium zinc mix that is available, and this is just a titanium mix. This took a day to dry. This took 2 days to dry, and this took 3 days to dry. This is one of the reasons why I absolutely encourage you, if you get into this, to make your own paint. And I'll be giving a demo on how to do that here in a few minutes, because not only is it easy, but you control exactly what's in your paint, and you control exactly what paint you use. And that's really important at this layer, because this layer is your foundational layer. This layer, this gray layer, this verdaccio layer, this is where you, if you have any mistakes, you need to correct them here. Because once the glazing starts, there's very little you can do to fix anything. And the reason for that is because once glazing starts, you're starting to use some really thick oils and thick paints, and you can't actually stop, paint over it, and then go on. It won't quite ever go back to the way it was. Now, I have done so. I actually screwed her hands up at one point because like I said, I have no patience. And so I painted on these before they were dry, which is a big sin. And you can see they're a little grainy because I had to go back and fix it after I started glazing. So it's not bad, but now when I look at paintings and I see grainy parts, I'm like, oh, I wonder if they had the same issues I did, that, they couldn't keep their hands off of it. Mm-hmm. So once this gray scale is dry, once it is done, once it is ready to go, you have what's called the underpainting. This is a study of two lions, obviously, right? Two lions. This is a Rubens. This is from 1660. But the lions, I really wanted to do the lions, and I wanted to have something to show you guys what an actual underpainting, when it was completed, looked like. Mona Lisa spent a lot of time in this phase because I was doing a lot of research on the fly as I was doing this, and I started doing a lot of research on glazes and whatnot. So this is what I'm going to show you on how to mull paints and how to glaze, because after this is the color. And each one of these layers has their own awesome things. I mean, it's like candy, right? you get the nougat center after you've started the chocolate. It's very much like that. There's the nougat abozo, and there's the chocolate underpainting, and then as a nice finish, it's the glazes. So can you tell I'm hungry? Or the glazing. I want to talk a little bit about pigments. I went ahead and made my own paint, and I learned that very painful lesson early on one of my studies. The Verdaccio is often done with what's called terra vert pigment, lead white and black, cool black, warm black, whatever. And I went down to my art store and I picked up a tube of what was called terra vert. And they were huge liars because it wasn't just terra vert. It had a bunch of other pigments in it. And when I started painting with it, I couldn't control it because it had all these other pigments to make it look that green. It's a modern paint, which means that they wanted it to be opaque. I was painting for translucence, which means that every single different piece of pigment that was in there had to rear its ugly head and ruin my painting. And by the time I was done, this study, she looked like Frankenstein. She was just ugly and green. And so I was like, okay, well, what's wrong? What am I doing wrong? Because it said terra vert. And they can't be liars, right? Nobody lies to you like that. Huge amounts of different pigment. So I actually ended up making my own pigment. Surprisingly enough, that's easy. It really is. And I started with, this is Verona Green Earth, and this is terra vert. Little powdered pigments, mostly earths. The period palette was very small, not very many colors. And they tried to have like a warm green and a cool green, a warm red and a cool red, and all the other, tried to set their stuff up like that. But even though they didn't have very many colors, and most of these colors are what they had in the period, not very many at all. The range of colors that you can get out of that through glazing is amazing. Because here is my grayscale, and here is the glazes made from these. And so the absolute range of colors, and this isn't even, I'm not even adding red and yellow to make orange. This is just straight glazed color. The range of colors out of that is astounding. But again, because they are all kind of in the same family and the same tone, not only do you have that brown under that holds everything together, but all these pigments run together very well. Unlike the Victorians, who loved color so much that they would use any color that they could possibly get their hands on. So that's another reason why these paintings really hang together. And it's delightful to look at this. I made this for myself just as a mnemonic guide. As an apprentice, my master would have taught me all about this. But for me to do this, it was really eye-opening. It really taught me that instead of feeling like I was hemmed in by just a few pigments, I actually had a huge range of pigments. So let me talk about pigments a little bit. Most of them are earth colors. Most of them came from Italy. Some of them came from further away. There is a mine in Afghanistan that still mines Lapis Lazuli that was used in period. I did use Lapis Lazuli, although as a student that probably was a no-no because it was the most expensive pigment. I had a benefactor. Ariane the Wanderer had been doing some painting a while back and had all these pigments. And he's like, you're getting into this here. Have all these pigments. And one of them was Lapis Lazuli, and I was like, so probably as a student I would not have been allowed to touch the lapis, but I did. So Lapis Lazuli is an amazing little color. And if you promise not to eat this, I'll hand it around so you can look at it. This is the most expensive pigment that I own, and it was the most expensive pigment they would have owned too. Not very much of it. In fact, there's a letter from the church to Leonardo telling him just how many soldi of lapis he can use, because the church was paying for it. So he was only allowed to use so much. And oftentimes in period, what they would do is they would do the fake blues, azurites or whatever, on the background, and the very last layer would be Lapis Lazuli, so you'd get that look. This is ultramarine. Actually, let me hold this up a minute. So this is lapis, and this is ultramarine. Look at the difference. I mean, it's an amazing difference. And I will use both because this is pretty much synthesized stuff, but the color is just way too bright. And again, this is modern pigment sensibilities, meant for opaque paint. So those are the blues that I used, consistent with the palette that Leonardo also used. I have a number of greens that I used. There's Verona Green Earth. Leonardo talks about that. I ended up not really liking Verona Green Earth because it was awfully blue. These paints do change once you put them in an oil. But it's a nice cool green. I prefer Terra Vert. It's got that kind of olivey tone to it, which I think does really well for skin tones. But it's a warm brown. And Leonardo also did what was burnt Terra Vert, which I have yet to experiment with because I live with people, and putting pigments in my oven in the kitchen and then burning them probably would not be healthy for the people I love. So I haven't done that yet. And then there's Verdigris, which is an amazing pigment because it starts out this bright, but in about 3 or 4 months it will turn a lovely shade of green. That must have been the scariest thing in period, to use this on stuff and have it be green and then wait for it to handle itself down, right? So again, don't lick it. After the greens, I have these lovely, and this is mercury, so if you wanted to, cleanse your palette of the lead with the mercury, here you go. This is crimson. I did not use this crimson in my painting because I couldn't get my hands on it, but this is probably one of the colors they would have used. There is also cinnabar, and again, notice that these are both warm and cool. So there's a warm red and a cool red, and that is very important. Cinnabar vermilion. And then this is Venetian red. Now I kind of like this because it's an orangey color, but it's a very, very warm red. And I ended up using quite a bit of Venetian red and Carmen Lac on this. The Carmen Lac was the only tube paint I used on her because I couldn't find it in pigment form until about a week ago. So, of course, right? But I really wanted this to be a little orangier rather than red because a lot of what I used to primer my colors it pointed to an orangey color. After these reds, I've got several yellows. One of them extremely dangerous. The other two are inert. This is lead tin yellow. It's made in really awesome ways, in caustic ways that probably, would kill you if you ate it. This is such a dangerous art thing. I love it. It's, you're just playing with your... I know. Anyway, so lead tin yellow, if you look at it, it's a very lemony yellow. So this is my nice lemon yellow. But I also have these lovely inert yellow ochre and yellow ochre light. Often in the same mine, you would get different colors of yellow ochre. Often in the same vein, you would give different colors. And it was all how it kind of came together and mulled up. The earth colors were the oldest colors that were used. Any ochre, any earth, verna earth, whatever, these have been used since cave paintings. And they are very inert. They handle the UV lighting very well. They don't tend to fade. And they're pretty good to work with. Whenever you start working with lead and mercury and copper and all kinds of those other fun things, you have to think about how is this going to react with other colors? Is it going to play nice with the lead tin yellow? And once you get into the glaze, what is it going to do? So you have to kind of think about that a little bit. Again, pointing to the roots that it has in illumination and calligraphy, because you have to think about that too. Orpiment doesn't play well with anybody else. And they didn't use orpiment in here, but the same can be said for any pigment. Last but not least are my blacks. I have a bone black. You get this by charring bone and then crushing it up. And then there's lamp black, which you get by burning carbon into a lamp and then scraping it off. The bone black is a very nice brownish color, so is the lamp black. They kind of have a different color when you mix them, so depending on what you're doing. Vine black will actually give you a bluish black. You can get a purple out of it sometimes as well. I prefer brownish blacks, so I do not have any vine black with me. Leonardo talked about all these pigments, talked about how he would use them, but it didn't seem to me like he used a lot of vine black. And then I have my lovely burnt umber and raw umber. Leonardo also used burnt sienna. I don't tend to like it because it's sort of a pasty, taupey color. I don't like it. There's a lot of evidence that many of the artists in the time period would gravitate towards colors they liked. So I felt pretty free to do that as long as it was kind of within the Leonardo palette. So here's my umbers. These are the things I made the Abozo wash and the Premature washes with. And then, okay, here it is, the lead white. Yay! You know, a lot of people were like, "Oh my God, how can you use something so caustic? How can you do this?" Easy. Once it gets into oil, it doesn't go anywhere. I do have a mask, but once it gets into oil, it's great. And there's nothing like it, really, nothing like it. And just a few weeks ago, all right, actually, I'm almost done with this part. So once a few weeks ago, I actually run across an article talking about glass fragments in pigments. And I was able to talk one of my pigment makers over in England into sending me lead glass ground up. So next picture that I paint is going to have lead glass in it because I want to see how that works. I want to see how it interacts with everything, how the light bounces off of it. But I'm going to send this around because I'm so excited about this. I had to bring it. All right, so those are the pigments I've used, and now I'm going to show you how to make your own paint because that is the fun part. So I have my handy dandy glass surface. Every picture that you see of painters in period, in the back is an apprentice mulling paint because that's what apprentices did. So learning how to mull my own paint was one of the processes that I needed to learn as an apprentice. I have my handy dandy glass muller that I would have gotten in Venice because Venice was famous for glass. All it is a nice surface that basically what it does is it introduces the oil to the pigments and makes sure that every pigment gets covered. That's important. And then I have my little scraper. So let me talk a little bit about oils while I'm doing this. Linseed oil was one of the basic oils used in period. They also used walnut oil. In fact, the Mona Lisa has a lot of walnut oil in her. I prefer linseed oil right now because walnut oil dries a lot thinner. Again, I'm a student. I'm an apprentice. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like a drunk baby with a paintbrush. So I want to make sure that I know what I'm doing and I have something that's going to handle me being a little aggressive or a little rough with it. And linseed oil is the best oil to use, at least for me. So you don't need very much because in the glazing process, it doesn't take more than a few things. And it sure doesn't take much oil either. Let's see if I can not mess this up. I love the smell of linseed oil, I gotta tell you. I really do. It smells like paint, you know, it smells like art. So there I have it. I told you all could do this. I mean, that's it, right? That's all. And I have yellow paint, lead tin yellow paint, which is a very period paint. All right, so now you guys go paint. So once I have my paint, obviously there's some other things that have to happen because I've been talking about glazes now for a while. And I'm sure some of you are like, okay, so what's a glaze? Well, let's talk about that here in a minute. Let me get this off of there. Look how pretty that is. Ah, such a beautiful color. All right, so anyway, period palettes. I have a modern palette and it's, you know, round and kind of huge. And it's way too big for my hand because I have short limbs. And I don't use it because it doesn't fit. So I thought, well, okay, I have all these pictures of artists in period, and you know I can see the apprentice in back doing the apprentice things, and you know there's some pictures of brushes, and so I really started sort of focusing on the palettes and what they looked like. More often than not, they were square. More often than not, they had a cutout here. And the reason for that is that this fits right here, and you can put all of your stuff right here, and then you can do your painting. And you can switch out brushes because each brush had a color on it. You didn't mix colors. And so you have a red brush, you need a red, put the red brush back, get a yellow. So it makes it a lot easier to hold these things. And this period tool, basically, that facilitates this kind of thing. I love this palette, absolutely adore it. I'm the only student that has one. And I just think they're just the coolest thing ever. Anyway, I want to put my pigment on here. Although I suppose I could mix it on here as well, but I want you to see, look at that. Notice that this color is the same as the tonal. So basically I know exactly what that's going to look like. That's important. All these things fit together in a little jigsaw puzzle. Okay. Any questions on pigments before I move on? Let's talk oil. What time is it? Oh, God. All right, so I could talk for hours. I really could, but I want you to see the last of the process, and I'm almost done. Let's talk oil. These little guys right here are examples of a layer of glaze. Basically a color glaze, that dries, then there's a shadow glaze, and then a highlight. So there's 3 different processes on each one. This is the first color glaze. You can see it actually, goes over the verdaccio, makes it look like a dead Spaniard. This is called the dead layer.
Yeah.
So it looks dead, but that's okay. You let that dry. Remember, I said patience. Let it dry. Then you put on another color layer. And then you hike the highlights after that's dry and put in the shadows. So here's my second glaze layer, second color layer. And then you put on the third glaze layer. Each glaze is the same amount of pigment, same highlights, same lowlights, everything. But I'm basically building the color up. Titian himself said that a painting was not finished unless it had at least 30 glaze layers on it. 30. But that's Titian, he's kind of an overachiever. For my Mona here, there are about 5 layers, and that's those 3 layers. There's a glaze, there's a highlight, and a low light. There are about 5 layers on her face. It took me less time to get the dress to fall in. More time, I spent a lot of time on the sleeves. This is directly painted. Overall, 15 weeks, about an hour and a half every day for 15 weeks, about 45 to 50 hours of work. Glaze layer after glaze layer after glaze layer, because painting the Abozo and the sketch and the verdaccio and the underpainting was in the matter of a week. It was the glaze layers that took so long. And the reason they took so long is because the oil had to dry. Now, you remember me telling you about how they discovered that pre-polymerizing the oils at some point would help them dry faster? Now, let me introduce you to linseed oil and its friends, stand oil, which means oil that has stood for a number of days, weeks, months, and sun-thickened oil. Can you guess what sun-thickened oil, how that was made? Very straightforward. Anyway, linseed oil, as I said, is a very nice sort of thick oil. Nice paint film, polymerizes nicely, takes forever to dry, unless you pre-polymerize it. And I want you to take a look at how thick this is. It's like honey. In fact, I thought about glazing a painting with honey just to see what would happen. So you take a little bit of sun-thickened oil. You take a little bit of either sun-thickened oil or stand oil. And look at the stand oil. Look at that. This is just linseed oil that's been set out. But it's pre-polymerized. It's pre-dried.
Oh, wow, the stand oil is really...
You add a little bit of Venice turpentine. Now, turpentine in period was not the turpentine we think of. Turpentine in period was a resin, and it helped get the film to be nice and strong and helped it dry. So this is actually turpentine, but it's a resin, not a turpentine. If you wanted a turpentine the way we think of it, you'd stick that in a distiller with your least favorite apprentice, probably, and you would distill turpentine. This is your paint thinner. Yep. And I want you to smell it. It smells awesome. So,
I want to smell a turpentine.
I know. So I went ahead and made up a glaze. This is glaze number 13. This is from Robert Massey's book. If you're interested in this kind of thing, Robert Massey's book, 100 and some odd formulas for painters, is a must because he has done all the work for you. This is a mixture of Venice turpentine, stand oil, and a little bit of distilled turpentine. This is the glaze. This will take 24 hours to dry. It dries so quickly. You know those stories where they had to wait for like years? No, this is awesome. So I'm going to put a little bit of this in here and make a glaze. So basically it's like thin honey, and you put just a tiny bit of pigment in here because the thing here is not an opaque paint. The thing here is a glaze layer that you can see through. Remember me talking about the layers that add together? So basically all it is this lovely adding the pigment. I'll probably put a little bit more in there. You don't want it, and sometimes you'll have a little more opaque than other times. Oh my God, that smells amazing.
Yep.
Now you know why I'm in such a good mood all the time. All right, so I've made this very thin glaze layer. Now, I'm going to show you a glazing sequence. Anyway, so the brushes I used were flats, rounds, and filberts. That was what was used in period. I didn't use any fans. I didn't use any fancy brushes. In fact, I picked the most cheapest, flattest, roundest brushes I could possibly get my hands on. I will be making my own brushes, but the whole sequence here on this was learning how to paint. Later on, I will learn how to make my own brushes, which seems pretty simple. But anyway, there's two types of brushes. There's hog and there's miniver. Hog is used for scrubbing things in. A lot of the highlights get hogged in. Such a great phrase, hog it in. But everything else gets this very soft brush. And when you go to an art department, they will try and sell you stiff brushes. Doesn't work for this. You have to get soft brushes. Stiff brushes are for opaque painting. So don't listen to them. Get your soft brushes. Make sure, again, that this is dry, 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 dry. I cannot emphasize that enough because I, as I said, am not a patient person and I have made these mistakes. I want you to learn from my example. Please. So I want to glaze one of these lions. And all I'm going to do, I'm going to take a little bit of this. It's pretty not so thick. And I'm just going to start glazing in. I'm going to avoid the highlights, or avoid the shadows rather, sorry. And I'm starting with a lighter one because I'm going to add some reds and whatnot. I want it to be a certain color. But already, can you see how that's starting to develop as a picture? I mean, isn't that just magic? It's just one pigment. But I have all these different things. All these different things have already been established in this underpainting. So you don't have to think about it anymore. All you have to do is do the color. Again, the creamy nougat in the chocolate center, right? So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to paint this in. And the lead tin yellow is pretty light, so I might add a little bit of yellow ochre in there. But it's not much pigment. And I will do this 30 times. I will bring the color up, take the highlight or the shadows down, add the highlights in, and keep doing that all the time until I get to what I want. So there's none of this having to do it immediately with direct painting, which is that modern concept. This is a very slow, very methodical, very focused, very constructive process. And I'm serious. Every single one of you could do this. None of this is rocket science. So I encourage you to actually go give it a shot. I really do. Because so much of what we do in the SCA is built off these paintings, but we never really think about them. We just think about what we're building. The process of building these paintings, however, there's an entire layer there. As you can see, I could have glazed this lion pink. So when we look at these portraits and these paintings, are those dresses really red? Are those people really that pock-free? Did they really have red hair? We have to think about these things now because that's not always how it worked. When you had a client, you did what the client wanted. So lastly, let me explain why I painted her as bright and beautiful as I painted her. The original Mona Lisa, of course, is this dull, faded green. She's been through hell. She's been in a wine cellar. She's been in an attic. She was in Napoleon's bedroom for 3 years, ill. So all these things this poor woman has gone through.
She's been breathed on.
She has been touched, years, and yeah. And so that looks nothing like what I painted because there's 550 years of aging on her. This is not how she looked when she was first painted. There's a company in France called Lumiere that actually digitally cleaned the Mona Lisa because the Louvre doesn't want to touch her, and I don't blame them. So this is what they think she looked like. And that's pretty close to what I did. I have to admit, blasphemy. I like mine better. But then there was this Prado painting, the Prado Mona Lisa. And this is exciting because they think this was painted simultaneously with the original Mona Lisa by a student of Leonardo da Vinci. Because the sketch that they found underneath this, the changes that are made on the sketch of this were also made on the sketch of this, which means that it was probably simultaneously done. And the experts are arguing about this, as they do. But I chose this as my color primer because this hasn't had the abuse of Mona. This just sat in the Prado forever because they thought it was a minor copy, because the Victorians, and this should be a common theme by now, the Victorians actually painted the background black to make her match the other paintings in the gallery.
Yeah.
I know, right? But that actually was good in a way, because when the Louvre contacted them in, I think it was 2010, and said, hey, would you mind taking a radiographic picture of this and seeing what's under there? They realized all this was under there. So after about 3 years, they removed that black background, and this is what came out. This background is virtually untouched from UV rays. It is the color that it was painted 500 and some odd years ago. So this became my color primer. Got my lapises, got my sleeves, Mona's face. This is a little pinker. But you'll notice that the face is not the same as the actual Mona. A master copy is not about making an exact copy. It's about learning how to paint. And so you do want to get close, but you don't want to get exact. That wasn't the whole process. So while I am pretty close, and it was pretty courageous to, here's the Mona Lisa, and here's how close I got, right? Pretty courageous to stand up and say, I didn't care. But I didn't, actually. So that's the process by which I put together my master copy. That's it. That's all. You could do this. You could. You really could. Trust me. Anyway, thank you.